welcome. We have a very important and informative show for you tonight. We're going to talk about immigration. And as you all know, it's really a hot topic right now. But we're not going to look at it really from a political standpoint, but rather look at it as a way to have a time with our expert guest, who's an attorney, to look at definitions and understanding some of the nuances between legal and illegal immigrants and asylum seekers and migrants and all these words that we're reading and thinking and worrying about. So we're going to really learn, I think, tonight in our half hour. With me is the perfect person to help us learn. Julia Decker is with me. And Julia is the policy director of the Immigrant Law Center. And she has worked there several years as an attorney and now is the policy director. Your background is so perfect for this job. As I said to you earlier, she has been at the ACLU as a policy director there. She's been at the University of Minnesota Law School at the Binger Center for New Americans, and was a fellow there for a couple of years and started that program, or worked in the beginning years of it. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary, for having me.
Oh, of course.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I feel privileged to have someone we can really learn from. Well, you know, as you and I were both saying, this is a hot topic, but a lot of misinformation out there. How do you kind of handle the broad look at immigration and the controversy?
This is a really good question. One of the, I think, key starting points when we talk about immigration is that it is an incredibly complicated and complex system. And people often say it may be second only to tax law, so in its complexity. So it is extremely complicated. The second sort of key point is that immigration law is federal law. So states don't really have a lot that they can do to change the rules or regulations around immigration. And then I think the third point is that there is a lot more nuance to the discussion beyond the binary sort of terms we hear in the media, legal, illegal, documented, undocumented. It is much more complex
more gray than black or white. Yeah. And that's what makes it both fascinating and also maybe harder for some people to really understand, of course. Reading lately in the papers about individual families and cases, there's so many hard stories that we read about. What are some of the biggest challenges as someone who sees things really up close comparatively that you think immigrants in our country at this time, we're taping in June of 24, what are some of the biggest challenges?
So maybe the first overarching point to make is that immigrants, refugees, regardless of their status, are people just like us, and so they will often face the same struggles that we face, whether it's getting a job, making a living wage, finding housing, making sure their kids are able to get to school. And what immigration status adds to that is an additional level of often hardship because of the status not being fully figured out, or maybe being in limbo with an immigration case for a long time. Many cases can take years. So it is
very stressful to be an immigrant, right?
It can be. And then when we also think about certainly sort of the ongoing discussion around racial justice in the United States, of course this will also impact immigrants and refugees who may come from backgrounds in which they are also part of those discussions around race in the United States.
Right, so that adds a whole nother layer, doesn't it?
It does.
Mm-hmm. And when you said it sometimes takes years, it also sometimes takes decades, doesn't it? And it's hard to put ourselves, or for myself, hard to quite fathom that. Decades of waiting and hoping, and it just sounds so very, very hard. In Minnesota, we have a lot of immigrants. What countries are most represented coming here, Gloria?
So it has changed over time. You know,
Sure.
we now have quite a large population of immigrants and refugees from Somalia. There are a number of immigrants and refugees from refugee camps in Southeast Asia, primarily Hmong Americans. Of course, we see many folks from Mexico, South and Central America, but also folks from across the world. Just, you know, for our office, Immigrant Law Center, we see people from every region, from across the continents.
Do we have many from Ukraine coming here now?
There have been, as with I think a lot of states, there have been new arrivals, recent arrivals, I would say, from places like Ukraine, Afghanistan, and I think that's another sort of thing to remember about immigration is it doesn't happen in a vacuum, even for us. As the United States, we are also looking at what is happening in the rest of the world and how that may be impacting people who are seeking refuge, people who are fleeing violence or potential harm. And, you know, for our immigration system, what does that mean? What is the system meant to do in those situations?
Well, when you say fleeing harm, of course, then I think of refugees, but let's sort of start and go through some of the categories of different kinds of immigration models, because the more I read, the more I'm kind of realizing I do not understand the nuances of some of the differences. So I asked her, would you help us kind of think in a little more simple and clear way about some of the categories? So immigrants, legal and illegal. Simple explanation of what makes someone illegal compared to legal.
So it's not exactly a binary is what where I would start with that.
Okay.
Somebody who is considered a legal immigrant is somebody who has some type of permission to be in the United States. Maybe they received refugee status in a refugee camp somewhere, and then they came to the United States as a refugee. Some people may marry a U.S. citizen, and then they are able to go through a process to get a green card based on being on that marriage.
And they would be then legal because of the marriage.
Yes, in a simplified, yes, there is a long process, as we sort of touched on. That process, we can say it in a few words, but those are one of those processes that can take decades. And then you have folks who, for any number of reasons, don't have documentation of their immigration status. They don't have permission to be in the United States. This could be somebody who came across the border between the United States and another country without permission, or it could be somebody who came in, for instance, with a visa that allowed them to enter the United States, but then they did not depart.
It expires.
And they just they overstayed their visa. And there are also lots of people who live in sort of a limbo because perhaps they have a case that is going through the process, but it hasn't been completed yet, and therefore they don't really have status in the way that this sort of binary distinction tries to
So
say.
they're kind of in limbo then.
Yes, but they haven't been found to be, you have to be removed, but they also don't have anything that says you can stay either. They're waiting for the Immigration Service to tell them.
Really hard. So they could not vote,
Right.
I'm guessing. What else could they not do?
So some people in that situation have to wait to even get work authorization. So they may not be able to work lawfully. And they may just not be able to do much of anything in that case, because if they don't have work authorization, they don't have income, and they don't have ability to move around, to even get basic daily necessities. So it really creates a difficult situation for some folks.
So, as you say, though, it's not quite as clear cut as we might have thought.
Correct.
Okay, let's have you define refugees.
So refugees, and I think maybe the follow-up to this is going to be about asylum, but refugees are people who have, for whatever reason, they are fleeing their home country, their country of origin, based on a fear of persecution, and they can't go back. That's sort of the basis for a refugee status determination.
Or they don't want to go back. But
well, there
some
has to be
end up having to go back.
There has to be a finding that this person is unable to be returned to their country of origin based on either they've suffered harm already or they're going to suffer harm in the future based on a certain characteristic, for instance, political opinion or ethnicity. So it is actually a fairly in-depth sort of process to decide if somebody is able to be a refugee.
And who would be in charge of that major decision over your life?
So there are a few different departments. So when we talk about immigration, we are often talking about the Department of Homeland Security, which involves a whole bunch of sub-agencies that we don't have to get into right now. You're also talking about the UNHCR, which originally was sort of the one who originally came up with some of these definitions.
The United Nations.
I don't recall the exact.
Okay.
It is the United Nations. It's they're the primary agency that works with folks who are displaced and helping to sort of facilitate that process. And then you often are dealing with Department of State as well, because Department of State has, some jurisdiction over some of these issues as well. So
that could be a complex
yes.
challenge for people, I bet.
Yes, and considering these designations or this process is often happening in refugee camps, which I think a lot of folks, you hear the term refugee camp and can conjure up just sort of basic understanding of what that means, often very difficult conditions,
Right.
difficult living conditions for people.
Pretty much across the board, wouldn't you say?
Yep. Refugee camp, the refugee designation is very much a recognition of the severity of a situation for the people who are fleeing.
One of the examples that I think is accurate of if you're fleeing a gang and cartel kind of activity in your country with fear of your children getting killed or you, am I correct in that assumption?
So this is sort of gets into the asylum question. So people who arrive at the United States border and may already be in the United States, oftentimes this is people from Central America where there is a lot of cartel
Right.
violence, gang violence. People are expressing that fear, but expressing that fear is
that's
only
not
the
enough.
first step. Yep. And people can apply for asylum if they are physically present in the United States. It is the same definition as a refugee, but the decision is going to be made here in the United States.
And those are backed up decisions, I bet.
They are, yes. There are lots and lots of those cases pending. And on the gang question specifically, there has been years and years of just litigation around this question because there are many, many elements for somebody to be qualified to get asylum from the United States government. And it is very, very difficult in all of those situations.
If I was an immigrant and I was hearing this, I think I would be so afraid of the future and so stressed out, so
Yes.
worried. I mean, it just sounds kind of like who knows how long this is going to take.
Exactly.
I mean, ideally you'd want to have an attorney helping you,
Yes.
but those are not, I mean, you do offer free services. We'll talk about their services later, but not too many people get access to a free attorney, I am guessing, in our country.
Yes, it is not like, first of all, there's no public defender system in the way that criminal courts, the United
Right.
States have. So there's no
Right.
guarantee that a person will have an attorney. And the need for, as I mentioned, people often are not able to work while they're in this process.
Right.
So that need for low cost or free legal services is really high. It's, often in very dire situations, and there's simply just not enough resources to meet all of that need.
That would partly explain, I bet, why people come where they have cousins or relatives, and then they can hopefully,
Sure, I mean, I
live
think,
with them.
yeah, kinship ties are certainly
A
a
big
incredibly
draw,
important
wouldn't they
thing.
be, for
Yeah.
where you go?
Yeah.
Well, let's see, asylum seekers then, give us a little more about how you define that
Sure.
population.
So this is asylum seekers, as I mentioned, they're going to be with sort of in that same definition as refugees, where they're fleeing harm based on a certain characteristic, and they can't go back. The difference is that refugees, that whole determination happens outside the United States. So refugees arrive in the United States with that refugee status. So they have permission to enter
That's
at
a
that
benefit
point.
then,
Yes.
isn't it?
The asylum seekers are people who arrive in the United States and or have maybe come into the United States in whatever status, whether they have permission or not. And now, as they are physically present here, regardless of how they came in, are saying, I now have fear, I'm afraid to return based on these same things that refugees are also going to be sort of screened for.
Okay.
And it is, as with the refugee designation, very complicated. So it's not a one sort of question and, oh, you
Right.
get status. It's a multi-step, often years-long process as well.
Wow, it's complicated. Real quickly, and then I want to move on to another burning question I have. But migrant workers, those are people, as I understand, who just come to an area to work. They're not usually citizens, correct? They're here to work. And if they don't find work, then what?
Well, it depends. Which is I'm sorry,
I
it's a
bet
very
you say
lawyerly
that a
answer.
lot. Yes,
It is a very
yes.
lawyerly answer, but I think it does really depend. There are some visas that are sort of targeted at allowing folks to come for certain, temporary seasonal work or other types of employment. But perhaps people are not coming with that visa either, and they may just be in a similar position as other folks who don't have status. And again, it's a very difficult sort of position for any of those
Right.
folks to be in because it is inherently sort of unstable. And I think also, just to sort of reinforce the idea of nuance, when we say migrant versus immigrant versus refugee, I mean people move across borders for any number of reasons, and they can often be multiple complex reasons. And one of the sort of things that maybe people don't think about is if you ask somebody, why did you come to the United States? Whether it's a farm worker or a student or a family, that answer may be very different than the answer to the question, why did you leave your home? Because
That's a good point.
anybody who's coming to the United States, whether temporarily or not, has left their home. And I think one thing to sort of really drive home is that what would we do as United States citizens? What would we leave our home for? Consider your house, your
question.
family, everything that you have here. What would
Right.
drive you to leave your home?
Right.
And those are often the circumstances that people are facing in other
That's
countries.
a really good question to keep in mind, because I think so many immigrants have had to say goodbye to an aging parent or leave some of their children behind even. I mean, it gets very, very sad and very complex for so many people, doesn't it?
It does.
Well, we could talk more definitions, but we've only got 10 minutes left. Just briefly, Julia, why does it take so long to become a citizen here in our country? I mean, it can take decades.
You can.
What is the roadblock there for citizenship?
So there are many roadblocks for any person in the United States who's not a citizen and wanting to become a citizen. Some people simply don't have a path to citizenship because certain immigration statuses don't allow that person to get a green card and then apply for citizenship.
Okay.
So that group just is not eligible. You have people who, as we mentioned before, maybe married a U.S. citizen, and they now have to go through that whole process of, confirming their relationship and getting all the paperwork together, and then, going to a consular interview. All these things that are part of the process, and that can take years, as we mentioned. And then they get their green card, and then they have to then get all the paperwork and all the money together for their citizenship application. So even though they have a path, it can take 10 years or more.
I have a friend who it was probably a 10-year path from England, married a woman from here. It didn't seem like it would take, so long, but it did.
Yep.
Well, so many questions I have.
So many questions.
I want to ask too about the new driver's license real quickly. That is now, is that a federal law? That must be a federal law.
It is. It's actually state law.
Oh, it is?
Yes. So driver's licenses are a state law function.
But so how does it affect the immigrants?
So this is a really good question, and this is one of the reasons that immigration law can be complex, because sometimes you're dealing with laws that are federal, and sometimes you're dealing with laws that impact people who happen to be immigrants, which is what the driver's license law really is about. So this was a culmination of 20 years of work, to be clear. It took 20 years to get this law passed. What it does is just say people who are applying for their standard driver's license in Minnesota don't have to show proof of immigration status.
Right.
So it's doesn't change anything about anybody's immigration status itself. It just says, if you go to apply for a driver's license, you pass all the tests, you do the road test, you pass all the vision checks, you pay the fee. You don't have to show us anything about your immigration status in order to be licensed if you've complied with all the requirements. And so, of course, this is good for people who are not citizens. It's also good for people who maybe are homeless, people who are facing difficult, maybe a domestic situation, which they can't get access to.
So they used to have to, though, fill out immigrant or not immigrant?
There used to be, for the last 20 years, there was a prohibition on licenses for someone who could not show some type of lawful immigration status.
Oh, okay, I understand. Well, the services you provide are free.
Yes.
That's huge. But you can't see everyone you want to see.
Correct.
So how do you determine who gets in and who doesn't? And not only are the services free, but you can talk to an attorney for free.
Exactly. So we have an intake line, and so anybody who has a question about their case is able to call our intake line. We have English and Spanish speakers. Okay. The hours and times are posted on our website, and the phone number is there as well. And the intake people will go through a series of questions just about the case and also about income, because we do set a limit on income in order to make sure we're
low income, right?
Yes.
Right.
And then if you seem to potentially qualify, you'll have an appointment with an attorney to go into more details about the case.
Do you do that in person, Julia?
Some of them are in person. I believe some of them can also be done via phone or remote.
Okay.
And there's a lot of different types of cases that we have the ability to serve. It really just depends on, each case is a little bit different, and depending on the circumstances, it may or may not be a case that we can take.
So if you can't take it, you give them ideas for other places, or what happens?
So if we are not able to take the case, there's a referral list, and so if somebody comes into an intake appointment, we say,
don't leave them cold.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, as I mentioned, this is the sad reality of legal services, not just with immigration, but across the board.
In general, that's true.
There's always more need than can be met.
And staff
and
Staff availability, yeah.
Yeah.
So for those of you who want to learn more, and I'm guessing there are many, give us your website, and then I've got the phone number if you don't have it memorized. But
I do. So the
Oh,
website
okay.
is www.ilcm, M as in Minnesota.org. And the main phone number is 651-641-1011.
oh, okay. I had a different number, so
Oh,
I'm
you
glad
probably
I
have
asked
the
you.
intake line. Is that the 1-800? Is
Yes.
the intake line? Yes. So the intake line is
Oh, okay. This is the intake line. It's 1-800-223-1368. So we'll put both those numbers
Excellent.
up for people. Well, we've covered the waterfront, haven't we? But
have.
I might have to have you back sometime, because I think the more we learn, the more informed we are, the better citizens we can be. And you know, I was talking with some of the crew before you and I started. I'm just a second-generation immigrant myself. I mean, and probably most of us are quite new. And so it behooves us, I think, to have empathy, to have knowledge, to be informed.
Yes.
So I appreciate learning more from you. Thank you so much for
Yes,
coming down.
thank you. My pleasure. I would
Yeah.
love to return.
Okay.
And, yes, thank you so much.
We will have a plan on that this fall.
Excellent.
Thank you for joining us. I'll be back again next week. Until then, have a good week.